The moment Paul Vance saw the woman slip from the edge of the bridge, he didn't think he jumped. A second earlier, he'd just been walking home from his shift at the auto shop, shoulders aching and boots soaked from the rain that had been falling all day. His mind was on his daughter, Zadie, and the dinner he still needed to figure out. But then that sharp scream cut through the air and his instincts kicked in. The cold river water hit him like a wall of bricks, stealing his breath. He fought the current, eyes locked on the dark shape flailing in the water. "I've got you, hold on," Paul shouted, kicking hard, reaching for her arm. Her fingers slipped once, then found his. She clung to him like her life depended on it because it did. He pulled her toward the riverbank, muscles burning, lungs screaming. When they finally collapsed on the muddy shore, coughing and gasping, Paul rolled over and stared at the sky, his chest heaving. The woman beside him coughed violently, then let out a shaky laugh. You just jumped in after me." "Yeah," he said, breathless. "You were drowning." She turned her head, eyes wide. "You didn't even hesitate. I couldn't let you die." Paul sat up, taking her in for the first time. Her soaked clothes clung to her like second skin, but underneath the mud and river water, she had this elegance to her. High cheekbones, intelligent eyes, like she didn't belong here in this city or this night. "You okay? You hit your head." "I'm fine," she said, brushing wet hair from her face. I didn't mean to fall. I was looking at the water and my heel." She stopped. "That was stupid. God, thank you." He stood, offering her his hand. "Come on, let's get you out of this cold." She hesitated, then placed her hand in his. "I don't even know your name, Paul," he said, helping her up. "Paul Vance." "I'm Juliette Grant." He nodded, not recognizing the name, not knowing it belonged to one of the richest families on the East Coast. He just knew she looked like a woman who didn't belong in the freezing rain with a man like him. They walked in silence for a few blocks until Paul stopped in front of an old brick building. "This is me," he said, unlocking the door. "My daughter's inside, so don't be surprised if a tornado in pink pajamas comes flying at us." Juliette blinked. "You have a daughter." Zadie, 7, smart as hell, talks more than any human should. Inside, the apartment was small but clean, warm. A few crayon drawings were taped to the fridge. And from the hallway, a little voice called, "Daddy?" Paul smiled. "Yeah, baby, I'm home." Zadie came running, her curls bouncing, but stopped short when she saw Juliette behind him. "Who's that?" "This is Juliette," Paul said, ruffling her hair. "She had a rough night." "We're gonna help her out, okay?" Zadie tilted her head. "You look like a movie star." Juliette laughed softly. "That's very sweet." Paul handed Juliette a towel and a hoodie from the laundry basket. "Bathrooms down the hall. You can change out of those soaked clothes." She nodded, disappearing into the hallway. Zadie tugged on his sleeve. "Is she a princess?" He knelt beside her. "I don't think so. But she's nice." Juliette returned a few minutes later, wearing his oversized hoodie and looking completely out of place in his modest home. But the way she curled up on the old sofa beside Zadie and asked about her favorite cartoons, that didn't feel out of place at all. Paul made grilled cheese while they talked. He tried to ignore how her presence made his too small kitchen feel warmer, brighter. When Zadie finally fell asleep on the couch, Paul grabbed a blanket and gently draped it over her. Juliette watched him with something unreadable in her eyes. "She's lucky to have you," she said softly. "I'm the lucky one," he replied, sitting across from her. "Her mom left when she was 2. It's just been us since." Juliette's smile faded. "I'm sorry," he shrugged. "We manage." There was a long pause. Then Juliette whispered, "You saved my life. You don't need to keep thanking me." He looked at her. "I'd do it again." She stared at him, lips parted like she wanted to say something else, but instead she just nodded. "You can crash here tonight," he said. "Couch isn't fancy, but it's warm." She looked like she wanted to argue, but then nodded. "Thank you." Paul pulled out some sheets, doing his best not to notice how beautiful she looked in his hoodie, not to notice how his heart beat a little faster when she smiled at him. He didn't know who she was. He didn't know she owned entire buildings downtown or that her last name was printed on the side of half the skyscrapers in the city. He just knew she was scared and kind, and maybe the most stunning woman he'd ever seen. And he had no idea how much his life was about to change. The next morning, Juliette was gone. She left a note on the counter, scribbled on the back of one of Zadie's drawings, "Thank you for saving my life. I'll find a way to return the favor." Paul stared at it for a long time. He didn't expect to see her again, but 2 days later she showed up at the auto shop in heels, sunglasses, and a tailored coat that probably cost more than his rent. Paul blinked. "You came back." Juliette pulled off her sunglasses. "You didn't think I would." "I wasn't sure." She stepped closer. "I owe you everything. You don't owe me anything." "Then let me buy you dinner," he laughed. "Juliette, I'm not the fancy restaurant type." "Good," she smiled. "Because I'm taking you somewhere better." That night, she took him to a rooftop bistro with candlelight and a view of the entire city. Paul had never eaten food like that, had never worn a jacket that nice, had never sat across from a woman who looked at him like he was worth more than the world. And for the first time in years, he let himself feel something he thought he'd forgotten: hope, and maybe something even deeper than that. Paul wasn't used to valet parking. He felt like an imposter as he stepped out of Juliette's sleek black coupe, his worn boots landing on polished stone in front of a building so tall it disappeared into the night sky. Everything smelled of jasmine and money. The doorman didn't even blink when Juliette wrapped her arm through his and guided him inside with quiet confidence. The restaurant was on the 50th floor and felt like a place where people signed oil deals or plotted global takeovers. Waiters moved like dancers in perfect rhythm, carrying trays of food that looked more like art than dinner. "I can't pronounce anything on this menu," Paul muttered, glancing at the gold embossed lettering. Juliette leaned in, her perfume warm and expensive. "Then don't. Point to something and let them figure it out." He raised an eyebrow. "You do this a lot." She tilted her head. "More than I'd like, but never with someone who's actually interesting." Paul set the menu down. "You're not what I expected." Juliette smiled without looking at him. "That's good." Expectations are boring. Their food arrived 3 courses of dishes Paul didn't recognize but couldn't stop eating. He'd never tasted anything like the roasted quail with truffle glaze or the saffron-infused risotto that melted on his tongue. Between courses, Juliette sipped her wine and asked questions that didn't feel like small talk. "Why cars?" she asked. Paul leaned back, fingers laced in his lap. "Because they don't lie. You take them apart, figure out what's broken, fix it. People aren't like that." She nodded slowly. "No. They're not." He watched her, the way her fingers toyed with the edge of her napkin. "What about you? What do you actually do?" Her gaze lifted to his. "You really don't know?" "No." Her expression flickered something between relief and disbelief. Then she whispered, "I run Grant Holdings." He blinked. "That sounds vague." "I own things, transportation infrastructure, shipping, real estate, airports in 6 countries, that kind of thing." He stared at her for a long second. "Airports?" "Yes." "You're serious?" She nodded. Paul scratched the back of his neck. "I thought you were a lawyer or something, maybe fashion." Juliette laughed, a real laugh this time, soft and unguarded. "You thought I was in fashion. The shoes and the way you talk." She leaned forward. "I do talk like someone who buys airports, don't I? I'm not sure what someone like that sounds like, but I'm starting to get the idea." Their server returned with dessert, something chocolate and delicate that shimmered under golden lighting. Paul took one bite and swore under his breath. "Do you ever eat burgers?" he asked. "Every Wednesday," she replied, "from a place in Brooklyn that only takes cash and insults you when you order." He chuckled. "I like that. I thought you might." They stayed long after the plates had been cleared. The view of the city stretched behind her, glittering like stars that had come down to play. Juliette folded her hands, her tone shifting. "I didn't mean to scare you the other night." "You didn't scare me. I scared myself." She paused. "Sometimes I forget how close I am to the edge." Paul didn't ask her to explain. He didn't need to. Instead, he said, "You want to come back to the apartment. Zadie's been asking about you." Her eyes softened. "I'd like that." That night, she sat on the floor of his living room, helping Zadie build a puzzle of the solar system. Paul watched them from the kitchen, arms crossed, unsure what to make of the way his daughter clung to Juliette like they'd known each other for years. "She should be in bed," Paul said eventually. Zadie pouted. "But we're almost done." Juliette smiled. "We'll finish the last planet next time, I promise." Zadie didn't argue after that. She hugged Juliette tight, then ran off to brush her teeth. Paul leaned against the wall. "You're a natural with kids. I used to babysit my cousins when I was younger. How many cousins do you have?" "None. I made them up so my mother would let me leave the house." He laughed. "That sounds about right." Juliette stood, brushing imaginary dust from her skirt. "She's something else. She is, and she loves you." Paul's voice dropped. "I try to get it right every day." "You do." They stood in silence for a moment, the air between them thick with something unspoken. Then Juliette said, "Come with me tomorrow." "To what?" "A gala." "Charity auction, black tie, the whole thing." Paul shook his head. "That's not my world." "It's not mine either, not really," he frowned. "You just told me you own airports." She stepped closer. "That doesn't mean I belong in a ballroom full of people who only smile when there's a camera pointed at them." Paul hesitated. "I don't have a tux. I'll take care of it." He looked at her for a long time. "You always get what you want." "No," she said. "But I'm trying something new." The next evening, a town car pulled up in front of his building. Paul stepped out wearing a fitted black tuxedo that had arrived at his door that morning, along with polished shoes and cufflinks shaped like miniature compasses. Juliette was already in the car, wearing a deep navy gown that shimmered like midnight. For a second, Paul forgot how to breathe. "You clean up well," she said, eyes raking over him. "You look like a storm I'd walk into on purpose." She blinked, caught off guard. "That might be the best thing anyone's ever said to me." The gala was at a private estate outside the city, surrounded by manicured gardens and high hedges. Inside, chandeliers dripped from the ceilings and string quartets played music that sounded too perfect to be real. Paul felt like a fish in the wrong ocean, but Juliette never let go of his hand. She introduced him to people with names he couldn't remember and titles that didn't make sense. CEOs, foreign diplomats, someone who apparently owned half the vineyards in France. Every time someone raised an eyebrow at Paul's presence, Juliette's grip tightened. When a woman with pearl earrings and a voice like smoke sneered, "And who is this charming mystery man?" Juliette replied evenly, "The man who saved my life." The woman blinked, her smile faltering. Paul didn't say a word. After dinner, the auction began. People raised paddles for paintings, yachts, and private islands. Juliette leaned over and whispered, "Don't look so horrified, it's mostly for show." Paul shook his head. "You live in a different universe. I'm trying to find a way to bring you into it." He looked at her. "Why?" She turned to him, eyes suddenly vulnerable. "Because I've never felt more like myself than when I'm with you." Paul didn't have a response for that. But when the final bid closed and the crowd began to thin, he reached for her hand and said, "Let's get out of here." They didn't speak much in the car. Juliette leaned her head against his shoulder and Paul rested his cheek on her hair. Back at his building, under the flickering light of the hallway, she stopped in front of his door. "I don't want to go home," she said softly. He unlocked the door, held it open. "You don't have to." And for the first time in a long time, neither of them felt alone. The first time Paul saw the inside of Juliette's world in daylight, it hit him not like a punch, but like stepping into a cathedral and realizing you're not dressed right. She didn't drive this time. A charcoal Bentley pulled up in front of the garage where he worked, and the driver, a stone-faced man in a perfectly pressed suit, stepped out and offered a polite nod. Paul stood frozen, grease still on his hands while coworkers peeked around corners pretending they weren't eavesdropping. Juliette stepped out of the car in a cream-colored coat that caught the morning sun like it had been stitched from light. Her hair was pinned back in a way that made her look 10 years older, but her eyes softened immediately when they landed on him. "Lunch," she said, tilting her head slightly. "Unless you're too busy fixing carburetors." He wiped his hands on a rag and walked toward her, ignoring the murmurs behind him. "You didn't mention there'd be an audience," he said, glancing at the driver. Juliette followed his gaze. "That's Harris. He doesn't talk. He just glides and judges people silently." Harris said nothing, his expression unchanged. Paul raised an eyebrow. "He judging me right now?" "Absolutely." She didn't wait for a response, just turned and got back into the car. Paul hesitated for half a beat, then followed. They drove through parts of the city Paul had never seen. The streets were clean, lined with buildings that didn't have rust or graffiti, and the people on the sidewalks didn't look like they were in a hurry to survive the day. The car pulled up in front of a museum, not a restaurant. "Lunch is in there," Paul asked. Juliette turned to him. "Private dining room, best view in the city, and they owe me a favor." The museum's upper level was closed to the public. A security guard nodded as they passed, and minutes later they were seated at a table beside a massive window overlooking the river. The silverware was so polished, Paul could see his own uncertain reflection in the spoon. Juliette poured them both water from a crystal carafe. "You're quiet. I've never had a date in a museum," she smiled faintly. "You still think this is a date?" He met her gaze. "Isn't it?" She didn't answer right away. Instead, she unfolded her napkin and laid it across her lap. "I don't know what this is yet. But I do know I can't stop thinking about you." Paul leaned forward, placing his elbows on the table. "Why? Because I dragged you out of the river." "No," she said, her voice quieter now. "Because you're the first person in years who looked at me and didn't see a number." The waiter arrived, placing 2 plates in front of them without asking for an order. Salmon glazed with something golden and thin slices of vegetables arranged like petals. Paul hesitated. "You didn't even look at a menu," he said. "I told them to surprise me." He took a bite and found it impossible to argue. They ate in silence for a while until Juliette spoke again. "My father died last year." Paul looked up, surprised by the sudden turn. "He was the reason I learned to tread water in stilettos," she continued. "He didn't believe in softness. I think he was afraid it would cost him something." Paul set his fork down. "And you?" "I think softness is the only thing that makes the sharp edges worth it." She glanced at him. "That's why I keep showing up at your door." Paul didn't know what to say to that. So he reached across the table and covered her hand with his after lunch. She didn't take him back to the garage. Instead, she asked Harris to drive them to a building uptown. Paul recognized it from television Grant Tower. 57 floors of glass and steel. Her name carved into the stone above the entrance. Inside, the lobby was a cathedral of marble and silence. People moved like they were afraid of being late to something that could cost them millions. Juliette walked beside him like she owned gravity. "Why are we here?" Paul asked. "I want to show you something." They rode the elevator in silence. When the doors opened, they stepped into a penthouse office with walls made entirely of windows. The city stretched in every direction, endless and glittering. "This is mine," she said. Paul turned slowly. The room was minimalist but not cold. A few personal items scattered across the shelves, a worn leather-bound book, a framed photo of a woman who looked just like her but older, and an old telescope pointed at the sky. "You don't seem like someone who needs to prove anything," he said. "I don't." She walked toward the windows. "But I wanted you to see it, because if this scares you, then we stop here." "It doesn't scare me," Paul said. "It just makes me want to ask why you come back to a tiny apartment with creaky floors when you sleep above the clouds." She turned to face him. "Because I've stood in this room every day for the past 5 years and never felt like I was standing still. With you, everything pauses." He crossed the room slowly, stopping just in front of her. "You're a hurricane, Juliette. And you," she whispered, "are the only man who hasn't tried to outrun me." The air between them shifted then, something unspoken becoming undeniable. She reached up first, fingers brushing the edge of his jaw, and then his mouth was on hers, fierce and certain. Later, they sat on the floor with their backs against the glass, legs stretched out, shoulders touching. "I used to think I'd end up with someone predictable," she said. "Someone who understood wealth and wore expensive socks." Paul laughed. "I'm wearing socks with holes." "I know," she looked over at him. "That's why I kissed you." His phone buzzed. He pulled it out, checked the screen, and his expression changed. "Everything okay?" she asked. "It's Zadie's school. She got into a fight with another kid." "I need to go." "I'll come with you," she said immediately. "No," he said, rising. "This is something I have to handle myself." She stood too. "Paul, I'll call you after." He left without looking back, and for the first time since they met, Juliette felt the sharp edge of doubt. At the school, Paul found Zadie in the principal's office, arms crossed, one pigtail half undone. The principal launched into a speech about discipline and emotional control, but Paul knelt beside his daughter and asked one question. "What happened?" Zadie sniffled. "He said I don't have a mom." He said only weird kids don't have moms. Paul's jaw tightened. He reached up, gently fixing her pigtail. You're not weird, he said. You're the bravest person I know. Zadie looked at him. Are you mad? No, but next time use your words, not your fists. She nodded solemnly. Later, when they got home, Zadie curled up on the couch with her stuffed bear and whispered, Is Juliette mad at me? Paul blinked. Why would she be mad? Because I made you leave. He kissed the top of her head. Juliette cares about you. A lot. That night, Paul stood on the fire escape, phone in hand, staring out at the city. He hesitated only a second before calling her. She picked up on the second ring. Everything okay? She asked. Yeah, she's fine, bit of a shiner, but she'll survive. There was a pause. I didn't mean to push you, she said quietly. You didn't, he replied. I just needed to be her dad for a minute. I get that. Paul took a breath. Juliette? Yeah, I've never been in love before. Not really. I thought I had once, but it wasn't this. It wasn't you. The line went silent. Then she said, Come back tomorrow. I have something to show you. What is it? A secret. He could hear the smile in her voice now. I'll be there, he said, and for the first time in years, he believed that maybe, just maybe, he could have everything. Paul climbed the marble steps of the gallery with his hands deep in his pockets, a bag of Zadie's favorite gummy candies tucked under one arm. He hadn't heard from Juliette since the night she told him she had something to show him. No address, no call. Just a message left in the form of a white envelope slipped under his door that morning, stamped with the logo of the Northbridge Modern Arts Foundation and a single line in her handwriting, Tonight. Come alone. He didn't ask questions, not when it came to her. The gallery's entrance was framed in stone columns and soft golden light, the kind that made everything feel like a secret waiting to be told. Inside, the space had been emptied for a private event. No crowds, no chatter. Just music playing low from a grand piano in the far corner, and a woman in a silver gown standing at the center of the room, her back to him. Juliette didn't turn around when he stepped closer. I used to come here when I was little, she said. My mother would drag me to art exhibits on Sundays. I'd pretend to hate it, but secretly I loved the quiet. Paul stopped a few feet behind her, hands still in his pockets. I've never been in a place like this by myself, he said. I always figured they'd ask me to leave. She turned then, slowly, and her eyes held something he hadn't seen before. Not softness, not sadness, but certainty. I wanted you to see this room because it's where I first imagined a different life. He glanced around. One with fewer suits and more mechanics, she smiled faintly. One where I didn't have to pretend I was made of stone. Juliette stepped aside, revealing the large painting behind her. It was abstract, bold strokes of crimson and deep indigo spiraling against a canvas of ivory. But Paul wasn't looking at the painting. He was looking at the brass plaque beneath it. On loan from the Juliette Grant Foundation, he read aloud, in honor of Zadie Vance. His breath caught. You used her name, he said, voice low. She's the reason I remembered what it feels like to be real, Juliette replied. You both are. Paul stepped forward, staring at the plaque like it might disappear if he blinked. You didn't have to do this. I know, she said, but I wanted to. He turned to her, something unreadable flickering behind his eyes. Why me? He asked. You could have anyone with a title, a yacht, 1,000 tailored suits. Because none of them would have jumped into the river, she said, voice steady. None of them would have let me sleep on their couch without asking what I was worth. His jaw tightened. I didn't want anything from you. I know, she said again. That's why I want to give you everything. He stared at her, then shook his head with a short breath. I don't know how to do this, he said. I don't know how to be the man who walks into a place like this and doesn't feel like someone's about to tap him on the shoulder and tell him to leave. You don't have to be anyone else, Juliette said, stepping closer. You just have to be the man who showed me what it means to be known. He didn't speak for a long time. Then finally, I'm terrified that all of this is going to vanish. It won't. How do you know? Because I've already lost everything that ever mattered and survived it, she said. I won't survive losing you. Paul reached for her then, not like a man lost in passion, but like someone reaching for the only thing he knew would still be there when the world stopped spinning. They stood in silence for a breath, then two. The music shifted behind them, a single note held too long. I want to build something with you, Paul said, Not just a life, a family. You already have one, she whispered. I just want to be part of it. He pressed his forehead to hers. Then come home with me. They left the gallery hand in hand. No cameras, no entourage, no fanfare. Just two people stepping out of the shadows of who they'd been. Back at the apartment, Zadie was coloring on the floor in her mismatched socks. She looked up, and when she spotted Juliette, her entire face lit up. You came back. Juliette dropped to her knees instantly. Of course I did. Zadie pulled a folded paper from behind her. I made you a picture. It's us and Daddy and Bear. And the moon. Juliette took it like it was a priceless manuscript. This is the most beautiful thing anyone's ever given me, Zadie beamed. I can draw you another one if you stay. Juliette glanced at Paul, then back at Zadie. I'm not going anywhere. Later that week, Paul returned home to find a new key on the counter. A small metal tag dangled from the ring. Penthouse 57. He picked it up, confused, and turned to Juliette, who was standing in the kitchen wearing one of his old flannels and pouring juice into a cartoon cup. What is this? Your new garage, she said casually. Well, technically, your new shop and office and rooftop garden. You'll still have to do the oil changes, though. Paul stared at her. You bought me a building. I bought us a future. He walked toward her slowly, still holding the key. I've been trying to teach Zadie that you can't buy love. You can't, Juliette said, stepping into him, but you can build a life around it, and that life needs space to grow. He kissed her then, the kind of kiss that said thank you and forever all at once. They moved into the penthouse a month later. Not because Paul wanted the view or the elevator that opened into their living room, but because it had enough space for Zadie to have her own art studio and a balcony garden where they grew tomatoes and basil in mismatched pots. Juliette kept her office at Grant Tower but started leaving early more often than not. Paul's shop opened on the ground floor, a sleek, glass-walled space that still smelled like motor oil and had a playroom tucked behind a curtain where Zadie could watch cartoons while he worked. She painted a mural on the wall of the shop on opening day, a skyline with stars and 3 stick figures holding hands underneath a glowing moon. When reporters asked Paul how it felt to marry into the Grant Empire, he just laughed and said, I didn't marry into anything. I jumped into a river and got lucky. The wedding was held in a botanical conservatory surrounded by wildflowers and music. Zadie walked down the aisle first, wearing a crown of daisies and holding a sign that said, Here comes forever. Juliette wore a dress that shimmered like dawn and walked barefoot across the grass to meet him at the altar. Paul took her hands and whispered, You're still the storm I'd walk into on purpose. She smiled through tears. And you're still the reason I made it to shore. They exchanged vows under a canopy of stars, with Zadie standing between them and Bear tucked under her arm. There was no press. No headlines, just family, just love. And as they danced under strings of fairy lights and the soft hum of laughter and music, Paul leaned in close and said into Juliette's ear, You know, every time I think about that night on the bridge. She turned, eyes shining. You regret it, he shook his head. Not for a second. I didn't just pull you from the river, you pulled me out of everything I thought I'd be stuck in forever. She kissed him, long and slow and certain, and for the rest of their lives they never stopped saving each other. The first thunderclap shook the windows of the penthouse, and Zadie ran barefoot into the kitchen, her arms full of papers and her eyes wide. We need to tape the windows, she said breathlessly. The wind might break them. Paul looked up from the stove, brow raised. It's not a hurricane, honey. It's just a storm. Juliette leaned on the counter, hair still damp from her shower, and tilted her head toward Paul. You didn't tell her about the window shields. I was getting to it, he said, flipping the pancakes. Zadie narrowed her eyes. You both are way too calm for people living in a glass house. Juliette extended her hand. Come here, doomsday girl, let me show you. They walked to the control panel near the front door where Juliette tapped a button. With a soft mechanical hiss, steel shutters began descending over each window in perfect unison. Zadie's jaw dropped. We're inside a spaceship, she whispered. Paul laughed. More like a very fancy box. Juliette crouched beside her. We're safe. You've got nothing to worry about. Zadie nodded slowly, then held up the stack of papers in her hands. I was working on something, for the shop. Juliette took the top sheet and studied it. Business cards. They have the shop name and a phone number and a little drawing of Daddy with a wrench. Paul turned off the stove and walked over, wiping his hands on a towel. He took one of the cards and smiled. You made me look taller than usual. Zadie grinned. I made you look important. Juliette looked between them, something soft flickering behind her eyes. We should print them for real, can we? Zadie asked. I'll call the printer tomorrow. That night, the storm rolled in heavy thunder growling like distant drums. Rain streaked the glass, but inside the penthouse, the world felt sealed and untouchable. After Zadie was tucked in, Paul stepped out onto the covered balcony, a mug of coffee in hand. Juliette followed, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders. She's going to grow up expecting storm shutters and custom business cards, he said. She's going to grow up knowing what it feels like to be held together. Juliette leaned against the railing, watching the lights flicker across the city below. Paul reached for her hand, threading his fingers through hers. She didn't speak for a while, and when she did, her voice was quieter than usual. I found the letter. Paul turned to look at her. What letter? The one my mother wrote before she died. It was in a box in the back of the estate storage. I didn't even know she'd written one. He stayed silent, waiting. She said she regretted teaching me to survive before she taught me to feel. She said she hoped I'd find someone who reminded me I didn't have to earn love to deserve it. Paul's grip on her hand tightened. She was right. Juliette looked at him, the flickering city lights reflected in her eyes. You never asked me to change. I never wanted you to. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a folded slip of paper. I was going to wait, but now seems better. Paul took the paper, eyebrows furrowed. He unfolded it slowly. It was a deed to a house, not a penthouse, not a tower. A 2-story brick home with a small yard just outside the city. There's a tree in the front that looks like it belongs in a Jane Austen novel, she said, and a porch swing. I thought maybe we'd want something quieter for weekends or forever. He stared at the document, then back at her. You bought a house. I bought a future, she corrected softly. Paul didn't answer. Instead, he reached into the pocket of his jeans and pulled out something small and velvet. Juliette blinked. That better not be earrings. He opened the box. Inside was a ring. Simple, classic. A single diamond set in a platinum band, but it wasn't new. The metal was slightly worn, the edges softened by time. It was my mother's, he said. My dad kept it in a drawer after she passed. Said he didn't have the heart to throw it away or the courage to give it to anyone else. Juliette's breath caught. I never thought I'd give it to anyone either, Paul continued. But then you pulled me out of a life I didn't even know was suffocating me. And I don't want to just build a future with you. I want to grow old with you. I want to fix broken radiators and argue about paint colors and watch Zadie graduate and sit on that porch swing while our bones complain. She covered her mouth with her hand. Paul knelt down on one knee, the box still open in his palm. Juliette Grant, will you marry me? Juliette didn't hesitate. She dropped to her knees in front of him, threw her arms around his neck and whispered against his skin, yes, yes. 1,000 times yes. He slipped the ring on her finger. It fit perfectly. They stayed there, tangled in each other while the storm raged outside. The wedding was held in the garden behind the new house. It wasn't grand or extravagant. Just soft music, candles in mason jars, wildflowers in old vases, and friends seated on mismatched chairs. Zadie stood between them again, this time holding a bouquet and wearing a dress she'd chosen herself, yellow with tiny stars stitched along the hem. Paul wore a gray vest and rolled sleeves. Juliette wore a white dress with a low back and no shoes. When the officiant asked for vows, they spoke without notes. Paul said, "You were the chaos I didn't know I needed, and now I can't breathe without you." Juliette said, "You were the calm I never believed could last. And now I don't want to live without it." They kissed under a sky that had finally cleared, and the guests clapped while Zadie shouted, "About time." After the cake was cut and the music faded, Juliette pulled Paul onto the porch swing, her dress bunched at her knees, her heels long forgotten. "You know what I realized today?" she asked. "What? You didn't just save my life, you gave me one." He wrapped his arm around her shoulders and pulled her in. "You gave me mine too. Years passed, but the rhythm of their life never lost its beat." Paul's shop expanded. He hired 2 apprentices who adored Zadie, and let her paint a mural across the back wall that read, "Built with Love." Juliette stepped down from her CEO role and launched a foundation focused on supporting single parents and young girls interested in engineering. She named it after her mother. They traveled sometimes in private jets, sometimes in beat-up pickup trucks. They danced in the kitchen on rainy mornings. They argued about everything from thermostat settings to camping gear brands, but they always found their way back to each other. Zadie grew up with a head full of stars and a heart full of fire. At 15, she built her first engine. At 18, she earned a scholarship to a university that Paul had once only seen on TV. She left home with tears in her eyes and a wrench in her backpack. On the night she moved into her dorm, Juliette held Paul's hand and whispered, "We did good." And he whispered back, "We did everything." They returned to the little brick house, to the porch swing, to each other. And in the quiet that followed, where no towers loomed and no storms approached, they lived the kind of love that didn't need rescuing anymore, the kind of love that had already been saved.